Book 1, Chapter 27 of Resurrection. Princess Sofia Vasilievna, Mrs. Mother, had finished her very elaborate and nourishing dinner. She had it always alone, that no one should see her performing this unpoetical function. By her couch stood a small table with her coffee, and she was smoking a pashitos. Princess Sofia Vasilievna was a long, thin woman, with dark hair, large black eyes and long teeth, and she still pretended to be young. Her intimacy with the doctor was being talked about. Nekhlyudov had known that for some time, but when he saw the doctor sitting by her couch, his oily, glistening beard parted in the middle, he not only remembered the rumours about them, but felt greatly disgusted. By the table, on a low, soft, easy chair, next to Sofia Vasilievna, sat Kolosov, stirring his coffee. A glass of liqueur stood on the table. Missy came in with Nekhlyudov, but did not remain in the room. "When mamma gets tired and drives you away, then come to me," she said, turning to Kolosov and Nekhlyudov, speaking as if nothing had occurred. Then she went away, smiling merrily and stepping noiselessly on the thick carpet. "How do you do, dear friend? Sit down and talk," said Princess Sofia Vasilievna, with her affected but very naturally acted smile, showing her fine, long teeth, a splendid imitation of what her own had once been. "I hear that you have come from the law courts, very much depressed. I think it must be very trying to a person with a heart," she added in French. "Yes, that is so," said Nekhlyudov. "One often feels one feels one has no right to judge." "Comme c'est vrai," she cried, as if struck by the truth of this remark. She was in the habit of artfully flattering all those with whom she conversed. "Well, and what of your picture? It does interest me so. If I were not such a sad invalid, I should have been to see it long ago," she said. "I have quite given it up," Nekhlyudov replied dryly. The falseness of her flattery seemed as evident to him today as her age, which she was trying to conceal, and he could not put himself into the right state to behave politely. "Oh, that is a pity. Why, he has a real talent for art. I have it from Repin's own lips," she added, turning to Kolosov. "Why is it she is not ashamed of lying so?" Nekhlyudov thought and frowned. When she had convinced herself that Nekhlyudov was in a bad temper, and that one could not get him into an agreeable and clever conversation, Sofia Vasilievna turned to Kolosov, asking his opinion of a new play. She asked it in a tone as if Kolosov's opinion would decide all doubts, and each word of this opinion be worthy of being immortalized. Kolosov found fault both with the play and its author, and that led him to express his views on art. Princess Sofia Vasilievna, while trying at the same time to defend the play, seemed impressed by the truth of his arguments, either giving in at once, or at least modifying her opinion. Nekhlyudov looked and listened, but neither saw nor heard what was going on before him. Listening now to Sofia Vasilievna, now to Kolosov, Nekhlyudov noticed that neither he nor she cared anything about the play or each other, and that if they talked it was only to gratify the physical desire, to move the muscles of the throat and tongue after having eaten, and that Kolosov, having drunk vodka, wine and liqueur, was a little tipsy. Not tipsy like the peasants who drink seldom, but like people to whom drinking wine has become a habit. He did not reel about or talk nonsense, but he was in a state that was not normal, excited and self-satisfied. Nekhlyudov also noticed that during the conversation Princess Sofia Vasilievna kept glancing uneasily at the window, through which a slanting ray of sunshine, which might visibly light up her aged face, was beginning to creep up. "How true," she said in reference to some remark of Kolosov's. touching the button of an electric bell by the side of her couch. The doctor rose and, like one who is at home, left the room without saying anything. Sofia Vassilievna followed him with her eyes and continued the conversation. "Please, Philip, draw those curtains," she said, pointing to the window, when the handsome footman came in answer to the bell. "No, whatever you may say, there is some mysticism in him. Without mysticism there can be no poetry," she said, with one of her black eyes angrily following the footman's movements as he was drawing the curtains. "Without poetry, mysticism is superstition. Without mysticism, poetry is prose," she continued, with a sorrowful smile, still not losing sight of the footman and the curtains. "Philip, not that curtain, the one on the large window," she exclaimed, in a suffering tone. Sofia Vassilievna was evidently pitying herself for having to make the effort of saying these words, and, to soothe her feelings, she raised to her lips a scented smoking cigarette with her jewel-bedecked fingers. The broad-chested, muscular, handsome Philip bowed slightly, as if begging pardon, and stepping lightly across the carpet with his broad-calved, strong legs, obediently and silently went to the other window, and, looking at the princess, carefully began to arrange the curtain so that not a single ray dared fall on her. But again he did not satisfy her, and again she had to interrupt the conversation about mysticism, and correct in a martyred tone the unintelligent Philip, who was tormenting her so pitilessly. For a moment a light flashed in Philip's eyes. "The devil take you! What do you want?" was probably what he said to himself, thought Nekhlyudov, who had been observing all this scene. But the strong, handsome Philip at once managed to conceal the signs of his impatience, and went on quietly carrying out the orders of the worn, weak, false Sofia Vassilievna. "Of course there is a great deal of truth in Lombroso's teaching," said Kolosoff, lolling back in the low chair, and looking at Sofia Vassilievna with sleepy eyes. "But he overstepped the mark, oh yes." "And you? Do you believe in heredity?" asked Sofia Vassilievna, turning to Nekhlyudov, whose silence annoyed her. "In heredity?" he asked. "No, I don't." At this moment his whole mind was taken up by strange images that in some unaccountable way rose up in his imagination. By the side of this strong and handsome Philip he seemed at this moment to see the nude figure of Kolosoff as an artist's model, with his stomach like a melon, his bald head and his arms without muscle, like pestles. In the same dim way the limbs of Sofia Vassilievna, now covered with silks and velvets, rose up in his mind as they must be in reality. But this mental picture was too horrid, and he tried to drive it away. "Well, you know Missy is waiting for you," she said. "Go and find her. She wants to play a new piece by Grieg to you. It is most interesting." She did not mean to play anything. The woman is simply lying, for some reason or other, thought Nekhlyudov, rising and pressing Sofia Vassilievna's transparent and bony ringed hand. Katerina Alexeyevna met him in the drawing-room, and at once began in French as usual. "I see the duties of a juryman act depressingly upon you." "Yes, pardon me. I am in low spirits today, and have no right to weary others by my presence," said Nekhlyudov. "Why are you in low spirits?" "Allow me not to speak about that," he said, looking round for his hat. "Don't you remember how you used to say that we must always tell the truth? And what cruel truths you used to tell us all. Why do you not wish to speak out now? Don't you remember, Missy," she said, turning to Missy, who had just come in. "We were playing a game then," said Nekhlyudov, seriously. "One may tell the truth in a game, but in reality we are so bad, I mean I am so bad, that I at least cannot tell the truth." "Oh, do not correct yourself. but rather tell us why we are so bad," said Katerina Alexeyevna, playing with her words, and pretending not to notice how serious Nekhlyudov was. "Nothing is worse than to confess to being in low spirits," said Missy. "I never do it, and therefore am always in good spirits." Nekhlyudov felt as a horse must feel when it is being caressed to make it submit to having the bit put in its mouth and be harnessed, and today he felt less than ever inclined to draw. "Well, are you coming up into my room? We will try to cheer you up." He excused himself, saying he had to be at home, and began taking leave. Missy kept his hand longer than usual. "Remember that what is important to you is important to your friends," she said. "Are you coming tomorrow?" "I hardly expect to," said Nekhlyudov, and feeling ashamed, without knowing whether for her or for himself, he blushed and went away. "What is that?" "Comme cela m'intrigue," said Katerina Alexeyevna. "I must find it out. I suppose it is some affaire d'amour propre. Il est très susceptible, notre cher Mitya. Plutôt une affaire d'amour sale," Missy was going to say, but stopped, and looked down with a face from which all the light had gone. A very different face from the one with which she had looked at him. She would not mention to Katerina Alexeyevna even so vulgar a pun, but only said, "We all have our good and our bad days." "Is it possible that he too will deceive?" she thought. "After all that has happened, it would be very bad of him." If Missy had had to explain what she meant by "after all that had happened," she could have said nothing definite, and yet she knew that he had not only excited her hopes, but had almost given her a promise. No definite words had passed between them, only looks and smiles and hints, and yet she considered him as her own, and to lose him would be very hard. End of Book 1, Chapter 27. Book 1, Chapter 28 of Resurrection. Shameful and stupid, horrid and shameful, Nekhlyudov kept saying to himself as he walked home along the familiar streets. The depression he had felt while speaking to Missy would not leave him. He felt that, looking at it externally as it were, he was in the right, for he had never said anything to her that could be considered binding, never made her an offer. But he knew that in reality he had bound himself to her, had promised to be hers, and yet today he felt with his whole being that he could not marry her. Shameful and horrid, horrid and shameful, he repeated to himself, with reference not only to his relations with Missy, but also to the rest. "Everything is horrid and shameful," he muttered, as he stepped into the porch of his house. "I am not going to have any supper," he said to his manservant Corney, who followed him into the dining-room, where the cloth was laid for supper and tea. "You may go." "Yes, sir," said Corney, yet he did not go, but began clearing the supper off the table. Nekhlyudov looked at Corney with a feeling of ill will. He wished to be left alone, and it seemed to him that everybody was bothering him in order to spite him. When Corney had gone away with the supper things, Nekhlyudov moved to the tea-urn and was about to make himself some tea, but hearing Agrafena Petrovna's footsteps, he went hurriedly into the drawing-room to avoid being seen by her, and shut the door after him. In this drawing-room his mother had died 3 months before. On entering the room, in which 2 lamps with reflectors were burning, one lighting up his father's and the other his mother's portrait, he remembered what his last relations with his mother had been, and they also seemed shameful and horrid. He remembered how, during the latter period of her illness, he had simply wished her to die. He had said to himself that he wished it for her sake, that she might be released from her suffering, but in reality he wished to be released from the sight of her sufferings for his own sake. Trying to recall a pleasant image of her, he went up to look at her portrait, painted by a celebrated artist for 800 roubles. She was depicted in a very low-necked black velvet dress. There was something very revolting and blasphemous in this representation of his mother as a half-nude beauty. It was all the more disgusting because 3 months ago, in this very room, lay this same woman, dried up to a mummy, and he remembered how a few days before her death she clasped his hand with her bony discoloured fingers, looked into his eyes and said, "Do not judge me, Mitya, if I have not done what I should," and how the tears came into her eyes, grown pale with suffering. "Ah, how horrid," he said to himself, looking up once more at the half-naked woman, with the splendid marble shoulders and arms, and the triumphant smile on her lips. Oh, how horrid! The bared shoulders of the portrait reminded him of another, a young woman, whom he had seen exposed in the same way a few days before. It was Missy, who had devised an excuse for calling him into her room just as she was ready to go to a ball, so that he should see her in her ball dress. It was with disgust that he remembered her fine shoulders and arms, and that father of hers, with his doubtful past and his cruelties, and the bel esprit her mother, with her doubtful reputation. All this disgusted him, and also made him feel ashamed. Shameful and horrid, horrid and shameful. No, no, he thought. Freedom from all these false relations with the Korchagins and Mary Vassilievna, and the inheritance, and from all the rest, must be got. Oh, to breathe freely, to go abroad, to roam, and work at my picture. He remembered the doubts he had about his talent for art. Well, never mind, only just to breathe freely. First Constantinople, then Rome. Only just to get through with this jury business, and arrange with the advocate first. Then suddenly there arose in his mind an extremely vivid picture of a prisoner with black, slightly squinting eyes, and how she began to cry when the last words of the prisoners had been heard, and he hurriedly put out his cigarette, pressing it into the ashpan, lit another, and began pacing up and down the room. One after another the scenes he had lived through with her rose in his mind. He recalled that last interview with her. He remembered the white dress and blue sash, the early mass. Why, I loved her, really loved her with a good pure love that night. I loved her even before. Yes, I loved her when I lived with my aunts the first time, and was writing my composition. And he remembered himself as he had been then. A breath of that freshness, youth and fullness of life seemed to touch him, and he grew painfully sad. The difference between what he had been then and what he was now was enormous. Just as great, if not greater, than the difference between Katusha in church that night and the prostitute who had been carousing with the merchant and whom they judged this morning. Then he was free and fearless, and innumerable possibilities lay ready to open before him. Now he felt himself caught in the meshes of a stupid, empty, valueless, frivolous life, out of which he saw no means of extricating himself, even if he wished to, which he hardly did. He remembered how proud he was at one time of his straightforwardness, how he had made a rule of always speaking the truth, and really had been truthful, and how he was now sunk deep in lies, in the most dreadful of lies, lies considered as the truth by all who surrounded him. And as far as he could see, there was no way out of these lies. He had sunk in the mire, got used to it, indulged himself in it. How was he to break off his relations with Mary Vassilievna and her husband in such a way as to be able to look him and his children in the eyes? How disentangle himself from Missy? How choose between the two opposites, the recognition that holding land was unjust, and the heritage from his mother? How atone for his sin against Katusha? This last, at any rate, could not be left as it was. He could not abandon a woman he had loved, and satisfy himself by paying money to an advocate to save her from hard labour in Siberia. She had not even deserved hard labour. Atone for a fault by paying money? Had he not then, when he gave her the money, thought he was atoning for his fault? And he clearly recalled to mind that moment when, having caught her up in the passage, he thrust the money into her bib and ran away. Oh, that money, he thought, with the same horror and disgust he had then felt. Oh dear, how disgusting! He cried aloud as he had done then. Only a scoundrel and knave could do such a thing. And I am that knave, that scoundrel, he went on aloud. But is it possible? He stopped and stood still. Is it possible that I am really a scoundrel? Well, who but I? He answered himself. And then, is this the only thing, he went on, convicting himself? Was not my conduct towards Mary Vasilievna and her husband base and disgusting? And my position with regard to money? To use riches considered by me unlawful, on the plea that they are inherited from my mother, and the whole of my idle, detestable life, and my conduct towards Katusha to crown all. Knave and scoundrel! Let men judge me as they like. I can deceive them, but myself I cannot deceive. And suddenly he understood that the aversion he had lately, and particularly today, felt for everybody, the Prince and Sofia Vasilievna, and Corney and Missy, was an aversion for himself, and, strange to say, in this acknowledgment of his baseness there was something painful, yet joyful and quieting. More than once in Nekhlyudov's life there had been what he called a cleansing of the soul. By cleansing of the soul he meant a state of mind in which, after a long period of sluggish inner life, a total cessation of its activity, he began to clear out all the rubbish that had accumulated in his soul, and was the cause of the cessation of the true life. His soul needed cleansing as a watch does. After such an awakening, Nekhlyudov always made some rules for himself, which he meant to follow for ever after, wrote his diary, and began afresh a life which he hoped never to change again. Turning over a new leaf, he called it to himself in English. But each time the temptations of the world entrapped him, and without noticing it, he fell again, often lower than before. Thus he had several times in his life raised and cleansed himself. The first time this happened was during the summer he spent with his aunts. That was his most vital and rapturous awakening, and its effects had lasted some time. Another awakening was when he gave up civil service and joined the army at wartime, ready to sacrifice his life. But here the choking up process was soon accomplished. Then an awakening came when he left the army and went abroad, devoting himself to art. From that time until this day, a long period had elapsed without any cleansing, and therefore the discord between the demands of his conscience and the life he was leading was greater than it had ever been before. He was horror-struck when he saw how great the divergence was. It was so great and the defilement so complete that he despaired of the possibility of getting cleansed. Have you not tried before to perfect yourself and become better, and nothing has come of it? Whispered the voice of the tempter within. What is the use of trying any more? Are you the only one? All are alike, such is life, whispered the voice. But the free spiritual being, which alone is true, alone powerful, alone eternal, had already awakened in Nekhlyudov, and he could not but believe it. Enormous though the distance was between what he wished to be and what he was, nothing appeared insurmountable to the newly awakened spiritual being. At any cost I will break this lie which binds me and confess everything, and will tell everybody the truth and act the truth, he said resolutely aloud. I shall tell Missy the truth, tell her I am a profligate and cannot marry her, and have only uselessly upset her. I shall tell Mary Vasilievna. Oh, there is nothing to tell her. I shall tell her husband that I, scoundrel that I am, have been deceiving him. I shall dispose of the inheritance in such a way as to acknowledge the truth. I shall tell her, Katusha, that I am a scoundrel and have sinned towards her, and will do all I can to ease her lot. Yes, I will see her, and will ask her to forgive me. Yes, I will beg her pardon as children do." He stopped. "Will marry her if necessary." He stopped again, folded his hands in front of his breast, as he used to do when a little child, lifted his eyes and said, addressing someone, "Lord, help me, teach me, come enter within me, and purify me of all this abomination." He prayed, asking God to help him, to enter into him and cleanse him. And what he was praying for had happened already. The God within him had awakened his consciousness. He felt himself one with him, and therefore felt not only the freedom, fullness, and joy of life, but all the power of righteousness. All the best that a man could do, he felt capable of doing. His eyes filled with tears as he was saying all this to himself, good and bad tears. Good, because they were tears of joy at the awakening of the spiritual being within him, the being which had been asleep all these years. And bad tears, because they were tears of tenderness to himself at his own goodness. He felt hot and went to the window and opened it. The window opened into a garden. It was a moonlit, quiet, fresh night. A vehicle rattled past, and then all was still. The shadow of a tall poplar fell on the ground just opposite the window, and all the intricate pattern of its bare branches was clearly defined on the clean-swept gravel. To the left, the roof of a coach-house shone white in the moonlight. In front, the black shadow of the garden wall was visible through the tangled branches of the trees. Nekhlyudov gazed at the roof, the moonlit garden, and the shadows of the poplar, and drank in the fresh, invigorating air. "How delightful, O God, how delightful," he said, meaning that which was going on in his soul. End of Book 1, Chapter 28.